All right, in this video, we'll begin looking at the worm unit, talking about worm basics first, and then flatworm basics, and getting into the first couple phyla of flatworms. So a couple things that are new with worms. One of those things is bilateral symmetry. We saw a little bit of that with cnidarians, but not very much. Bilateral symmetry is where you have one single line of symmetry throughout the organism. This allows for a couple things, allows for specialization from top to bottom, segmentation, and then allows for cephalization, which is the formation of a head, and allows for a central nervous system, which is exactly what you see occurring as worms get more and more complex. Flatworms have less of that, but as you get into the annelids, the segmented worms, you have more of a centralization of their nervous system. And of course, here's an arthropod that has a complex central nervous system. Worms are triploblastic also. This means that they have 3 tissue layers. We've talked about the endo and ectoderm already. And so here we have the addition of the mesoderm. The mesoderm is where you're going to have tissues like muscle and bone arise. Obviously, in worms, we're not going to have bone, but later that's going to occur. Also, with triploblastic organisms, you have the formation of what's called a coelom. And a coelom is just a fancy word for a body cavity, which is just the space inside the body that is not the digestive tract. The space, like when you open, if you were to look inside of a body, there's a lot of space in there that isn't this tube. This tube is the digestive tract. And so there's 3 different kinds of coeloms found in worms. The first one is called an acoelomate, which is just no coelom. These are flatworms. Because they have no body cavity, they typically have to be very small. They're just solid throughout. The pseudocoelomates are roundworms or nematodes, and they have a partially lined coelom. So you can see here the coelom is partially lined with mesoderm, but this gut is not lined. The outside of the gut is not lined. And so it's called a pseudocoelomate or a false coelom. And then the true coeloms, or the coelomates, are the body cavity is completely lined with mesoderm, and this is we're going to see this in segmented worms and in all the animals that we'll talk about for the rest of the year. The first phylum we'll look at are called Acelamorpha. These are very small flatworms. For a definition for worm, a worm is just an elongated bilateral invertebrate without appendages. And so a couple of things there. Invertebrate, bilateral, no appendages, typically having this elongated look to them. But that's relative. As you can see with these worms, they're not all that long. These worms live in marine sediments. They're mostly free living, which means that they are not parasitic. A parasitic organism is not free living, it has to have a host, whereas a free living organism kind of does its own thing. There is a concentration of nerves at the anterior end. Anterior means toward the head, and so that means that there is some semblance of cephalization, beginnings of a brain. They have mesodermal muscle. They have a ciliated epidermis that is cellular, so as opposed to like a cuticle, like an outer coating that is not living. They have a ciliated cellular epidermis. They have statocysts and ocelli, which is just similar to the cnidarians that we talked about. They reproduce asexually by fragmentation. We'll see that in Platomenthis as well. That if you cut them in half, essentially they'll just grow. So that's asexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction, you also see that in these organisms. They're monoecious in that they are hermaphroditic. They have both sex organs. They don't have a respiratory or an excretory function. That doesn't mean that they don't get rid of nitrogenous waste and they're not taking in oxygen and getting rid of CO2. Those things are still happening. They're just happening through diffusion as opposed to having dedicated organs for that. The next phylum is called Platomenthis. This is where we're going to spend most of our time in flatworms. These are flatworms that range from 1 millimeter to many meters in length, depending on the type. Bodies typically have this ribbon-like appearance like you see here. This includes free-living flatworms like planaria and some others, and includes parasites, which is going to be the majority of the group. They inhabit marine, freshwater environments. Some are even terrestrial, but they have to be moist environments. They are acoelomates. They have bilateral symmetry. They have an incomplete gut, which you can see here. This is their gut, this branching looking thing, and this is their external pharynx, which is how they obtain their food, almost like a vacuum hose on their stomach, if you want to think about it that way. They reproduce. They have kind of a centralization here. This looks like eyes, but it's just eye spots. They reproduce from fragmentation, which is again asexual, but some of them are able to reproduce sexually as well, and they're monoecious. They have a syncytial body covering, so it's called a neodermis. Remember, syncytial is like one big cell, so it's a living thing, but it's not, not what you would think of as far as an epidermis is concerned. Let's see, I don't have any pictures of. I can use this picture. They have an extracellular system that have these cells called flame cells. We'll look more about that in the next video. Other systems are mostly lacking because, again, theirs are really small and they do a lot of their body systems with simple diffusion. We're going to look at 4 different classes. The turbularians, which are free-living flatworms. Trematoda, um, these are flukes and are parasites. Monogenea, also parasites. These are one-host parasites. And Cestoda, which are like tapeworms. So we'll be looking more at those classes in the next video.